What if a simple request from a man about to die could change an entire town? It seems impossible, right? But what if I told you that in the Old West, stories like this are more common than you might think? Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will touch your heart in a way you never expected. It's a story of courage, compassion, and a decision that, even at the end of life, was able to transform everything around him. Picture this scene: an isolated town marked by the silence of dust and the harshness of everyday life. The sandy streets knew nothing of joy, and the people, burdened by survival, barely looked at one another. In the midst of this tough routine, a man was nearing the end of his journey, but he wasn't just any cowboy. He was someone who, through his quiet actions, had already touched the lives of many, never expecting any recognition. His name was Jack Dawson. Now, you're probably wondering, what could he ask for? How could one simple request change everything? Stick with me until the end, and you'll discover that, as simple as it was, Jack's request was a true revolution for an entire town. Sometimes greatness doesn't lie in grand battles or epic victories, but in a single act of kindness, a simple choice made at the right moment. And Jack Dawson knew this very well. What happened in that town, right after Jack's last request, is something few would believe. And trust me, what you're about to discover might surprise you in ways you never imagined. How could a man on the brink of death leave such a profound legacy in an entire community? What was the key to this transformation? What he did may seem simple, but the real magic was in the mentality he inspired and the impact he created. Have you ever gone through something like that? Ever had to make such a significant decision that even unknowingly, it changed the destiny of everyone around you? Sometimes, what seems like a small choice has the power to rewrite history. Join me, because along this journey, you'll see how the humblest actions can create waves of change, even in the most challenging situations. Now, with all of this in mind, I'm going to take you even deeper into this story to show you how Jack's simple request was the key to transforming the mentality of that town and creating a movement of unity and compassion that lasted for generations. The impact was so great that you'll be asking yourself, how could such a simple act create such a profound change? Stay with me, because what's coming next will leave you even more surprised. Let's discover how Jack Dawson's request forever altered the fate of that town. And who knows, it might even change the way you see the power of choices. Now, imagine the impact Jack's request had. He didn't ask for riches or material possessions. He didn't ask to be remembered as a hero. What he asked for was something much simpler, yet at the same time, much deeper: the unity of the town. He wanted people to start helping each other, to support one another, to see the humanity in the next person, even when the hardships of life seemed unbearable. And while this request came at the end of Jack's life, it was one that reverberated in ways no one expected. As the days went by, the town started to realize. As the days passed, people began to realize that maybe that man wasn't so far from the truth after all. He asked for something that seemed so simple, yet could change everything: connection between people. Every small act of kindness started to have an impact no one had anticipated, and those who were willing to listen began to see their own lives in a different way. Instead of viewing others as competitors or enemies, they began to realize that together they could be stronger. Now, I know you're probably thinking, but did this really happen? Could a simple request have changed so much? Believe me, what you're about to discover will challenge the way you see everyday actions. I guarantee that, just like Jackstown, you too may be surprised by the power of a single act of compassion. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment and share what's touched you the most so far. Have you ever made or witnessed a simple gesture that unexpectedly transformed a situation? Or perhaps you have a personal experience that connects with what we're talking about here. Your participation is what helps this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. The more you engage, the more powerful stories we can share together. And if you're enjoying this story, be sure to like the video. With every like, more people can learn about the power of small actions and how they can truly change the world around us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take a moment to do so and keep following all the amazing stories we have to tell. By being part of this community, you'll not only connect with stories like Jack's, but also contribute to inspiring more people to believe in the transformation that a simple act of kindness can create. Now Jack Dawson's story is about to gain even more strength, and the impact he caused is just beginning. So stay with me, because what comes next will surprise you even more. Let's keep exploring how the legacy of this ordinary man began transforming an entire town, and how this could in some way transform your own life. Jack Dawson wasn't your typical cowboy. Jack Dawson wasn't the kind of cowboy you see in movies. He didn't wear a shiny hat or a pristine leather coat, and certainly didn't have the kind of courage that would allow him to face a crowd with a pistol in each hand. But if you looked closer, you'd see that Jack's true greatness was in something many Hollywood heroes simply don't have: a heart capable of caring for others, even when he himself didn't have much to give. He wasn't someone who stood out for grand feats, but rather for his ability to do good in a simple, silent way, without ever expecting recognition or applause. Jack's life wasn't easy. Like many other cowboys in the Old West, he faced the harsh realities of life in desolate lands, where the fight for survival was present in every gesture, in every choice. But instead of being consumed by the selfishness that often took hold of those who lived in those regions, Jack chose a different path. He learned to live with little, to value what he had, and to extend a hand to those who needed it most. It wasn't charity, no, he believed, that in a world so marked by violence and solitude, something as simple as a kind gesture could change everything. When he arrived in a town, Jack wasn't recognized as the cowboy who would save the day or the hero who would bring easy solutions to the problems. But that's exactly what he did, in a way no one saw. He helped without expecting anything in return, sometimes without words, just with actions. Unlike the other men of the West, who saw the weak and the needy as a burden, Jack saw opportunities for change. He knew that the toughest moments could be faced with humanity, with compassion. Maybe for him, true strength wasn't about how much you could endure, but about how much you could give to others. He made friends, but also gained the respect of strangers. He made friends, but also earned the respect of strangers, even those who by nature were always on the fringes of society. And when something truly important happened, when the choices made throughout his life were tested in the most intense way, that's when his true nature shone through. The small acts of kindness he spread over the years began to transform into something bigger. Not a great revolution, but a gradual shift in the way people saw the world around them, how they saw themselves, and especially how they saw each other. Jack's actions were starting to take root in barren soil, where doubt and fear ruled. And without him even realizing it, these roots were spreading throughout the town. But perhaps the greatest transformation Jack experienced didn't happen when he was full of life. In fact, the big change began when he was close to leaving. As if his journey was just beginning, he made a request, and this simple yet profound request would end up rewriting the history of that town. Jack didn't know it, but what seemed like a final decision, something so personal and seemingly insignificant, would have such a huge impact that no one there could have ever imagined. Now, I want to dive even deeper into this. What made Jack Dawson so different? What was this final request that even in his last moments created something that could change the town forever? The truth is, the power of his actions was in something many of us forget, that small choices made with the heart can have an impact far greater than we can imagine. It's not about being famous or recognized, but about living with the intention to make a difference. Jack Dawson was far from being the kind of cowboy you find in books or movies. He didn't have that aura of a great warrior, and his heroic feats weren't described in epic tones. But if you looked closer, you'd see that Jack's value wasn't in what he did, but in who he was. He was a man who believed, above all, in the power of small choices, in the simple actions that, over time, built something grand. The truth is, Jack's impact wasn't just in his actions, but in the example he set wherever he went. It was in one of these seemingly simple moments that Jack's life took an unexpected turn. One day, while riding through the trails of the West, he encountered a group of natives. It wasn't an uncommon sight, but something felt different this time. There was a heavy silence in the air. The tension between the tribes and the settlers was still very strong, and Jack knew that one wrong move could mean the end of everything. However, instead of backing away or acting with hostility, something inside him made him stop. He didn't know it at the time, But that encounter would change the course of his life and of the whole town. Those natives, who were seen by many as enemies, were in a desperate situation. They were wounded, hungry, and had no resources to continue. Jack's decision in that moment would be a turning point, not only for him but for the entire community. It wasn't just a matter of helping them, it was a matter of humanity. He could have kept riding, could have ignored their request for help, but he knew something bigger was at play. Jack didn't see the natives as enemies, but as human beings with their own pain and needs. He saw them as equals, and that was what made him act so differently than what was expected of him at that time. Jack wasn't a man of many words, but he knew what a gesture of compassion meant. Instead of taking the path of indifference or violence, he offered food, shelter, and most importantly, respect. He treated them as human beings, as people with their own stories, not as enemies. This simple act of kindness, which to him was just a natural response, ended up resonating much further than he could have imagined. Those natives, who had once been seen only as a threat, began to look at Jack differently. But most importantly, it was how Jack's actions were perceived by those around him. It wasn't just the help he gave, but the mindset behind it. It wasn't just the help he gave, but the mindset behind it. He was showing, through his own actions, that true courage wasn't about protecting oneself from others, but about reaching out, about looking at those around you with empathy and compassion. The encounter with the natives wasn't just an isolated moment of kindness. It was the beginning of a new way of seeing the world. Jack, unknowingly, was planting the seed of a profound transformation, not just in those around him, but in the whole town that had, until then, lived under the weight of distrust and fear. Now, I want to dive even deeper into this, because the transformation Jack began that moment didn't stop there. He didn't know it, but his simple choice to help those natives was creating a wave of change, a new mentality that would begin to spread among the town's inhabitants. The power of a single gesture might have seemed small, but the impact it had was immeasurable. He started to change people's views, how they saw each other, and the idea that a man was nothing alone, but everything, when willing to act for the common good. As this story unfolded, the town started to transform from the inside out. And you know what's most interesting about all of this? The fact that Jack never sought to be the hero. He just did what he believed was right, genuinely, and the impact of that was much deeper than he could have imagined. Jack Dawson, as we've seen, wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke for themselves. He didn't need recognition or applause. His heart and way of living were already a true lesson for everyone around him. However, as often happens in great stories, there was something more waiting for him, something he could never have predicted, but that would change the course of everything. After years of silent and generous dedication, Jack began to feel the weight of time. The advanced age and the hardships of life in the West were taking their toll. He knew the end was near, but instead of resigning himself to the idea that his journey was coming to an end with nothing more to give, Jack did something no one could have imagined. He made a request. A simple request, but one that would resonate throughout the town and forever change the mindset of those who knew him. When Jack was about to leave, he made a request no one there would ever forget. It wasn't a request for riches or a selfish wish. He didn't ask to be remembered as a hero or for his story to be told in every corner of the Old West. What he asked for was something much deeper, something that, at the time, seemed too simple for the grandeur of his journey. But as often happens, the most powerful things are those that emerge quietly. He asked for something that could transform the entire town, something that would touch the hearts of the people in a way they never imagined. He didn't want anything more for himself. What he asked for was a shift in the collective mindset, a transformation in the heart of the town. Jack wished for the community, marked by years of distrust and selfishness, to finally come together. He asked that the people start helping one another, to abandon the loneliness and fear of others, so that they could support each other and build a better future together. It was a simple request, but full of wisdom. It was a simple request, but full of a wisdom that only someone like Jack could possess. He knew that no matter how harsh life had been, the true strength of a man and of a community lies in the ability to be empathetic, to extend a hand, to support others instead of constantly protecting oneself. That request, though seemingly small, carried the essence of what Jack had always believed. When we come together, we are far stronger. And the most surprising thing about it all was that, at the time, no one fully understood what he meant. Those around his deathbed heard his words, but they were immersed in their own struggles and for a moment couldn't grasp the true impact of his request. But the power of his words wasn't in the urgency of the moment. He didn't need to explain the depth of what he was asking for. The words he spoke, simple as they were about to plant a seed much bigger than anyone could imagine. Jack Dawson's request wasn't just a wish for compassion. It was a call for people to look at one another not as rivals or strangers, but as brothers and sisters. He was asking for them to stop seeing each other as competitors, but as part of something bigger. He was asking for people, in that Wild West, where survival often kept them from truly connecting, to finally see themselves as a part of a greater whole. Now let's go even deeper into this, because Jack's request wasn't something that faded with time. On the contrary, it began to grow, to spread through the streets of that town like a seed slowly germinating, but soon taking over everything around it. What seemed like a simple request, the last wish of a man on his deathbed, began to transform into something vast, something that shook the deepest foundations of that community. People, little by little, began to realize how powerful that request was. It wasn't just about Jack or the end of his life. It was about the legacy he was leaving, the mindset he wanted to instill in everyone. Unity, compassion, and mutual aid started to take shape in ways no one had expected. And although Jack didn't live to see the fruits of that request, he left an indelible mark that forever transformed the town. When Jack Dawson made his request, no one around him knew the impact it would have. His eyes were tired, his voice weak, but there was a silent strength in the words he was about to speak. He didn't ask to be remembered, didn't ask for fame or riches, and certainly didn't ask for glory. What Jack asked for, in that moment of fragility, was something that many might consider idealistic or even naive. He asked for something simple, but something that had the power to transform the lives of everyone around him. He asked for just one thing, that everyone in the town come together and help each other, so that the town could thrive as a true community. It wasn't the request of a man trying to change the world, but of someone who knew that change started right there, in the small piece of land where he had spent his life. In his last words, Jack didn't talk about riches or the conquest of new territories. He didn't ask for any personal advancement. What he wanted, with all sincerity, was for people to stop living in isolation, for distrust to be put aside, and for the town's residents to finally see themselves as part of a whole. It was a revolutionary vision for the time, a request so simple, yet carrying the essence of a radical transformation. In the Wild West, where selfishness and the struggle for survival were the norm, asking people to unite seemed almost utopian. The mentality of the time was that life was a constant battle, where each person took care of themselves, and any weakness was to be avoided. Jack's request was more than a hope. It was a call for everyone to start seeing the other as an ally, not a threat. In that moment, the simplicity of Jack's request was imbued with a wisdom that many couldn't understand right away. He wasn't asking for the impossible, but for something that could change everything. To him, true prosperity wasn't about accumulating wealth or gaining status, but about creating a united community where empathy was stronger than individualism. Jack knew that the strength of a town wasn't in weapons or in the power of the richest men, but in the hearts of the people, in how they supported and cared for one another. The most curious thing is that, although Jack made his request with complete clarity, no one truly understood the magnitude of his vision at that moment. They were so immersed in their own struggles and limitations that Jack's request seemed more like a final wish than a true call for change. Many probably thought he was just speaking out of sentiment, like any man on the brink of death reflecting on what he hadn't accomplished, but the real impact of his request was just beginning to unfold. In the days following his death, the town continued on as usual. Nothing seemed different at first glance, but slowly, something began to change. Those who knew him began to reflect on what Jack had said. His words, which had once seemed simple, started to echo in their hearts. And, one by one, the townsfolk began to ask themselves, what if the answer to our problems wasn't fighting against each other, but helping each other? Something invisible began to happen. It started with a small gesture, a hand extended, a request for help from someone who had once been a stranger. But these small gestures began to multiply. People started to look at one another with more empathy, began helping one another more actively, as if a new understanding about life had emerged. Now, let's go even deeper into this topic, because Jack's simple request had a far more lasting impact than anyone could have imagined. What he did was sow an idea that slowly began to bloom, like a flame that, at first small, grew to consume everything around it. What seemed like an insignificant request soon turned into a quiet revolution that transformed the mentality of the town and, over time, became the foundation for a new way of living. Jack didn't know it, but his last lesson would turn out to be the most valuable of all. When Jack Dawson made his request, no one in the town truly understood what he meant. It was as if he was speaking a different language, something far removed from the reality of everyone around him. The town had lived in distrust for so long, where every man and woman saw themselves as solely responsible for their own survival. The mentality was clear. The West was a harsh land where the only way to stand strong was by fighting, and where mutual help seemed more like a utopia than a real possibility. And at that moment, when Jack, on his deathbed, asked the people to begin uniting, many looked at him with suspicion. It was a request so simple, yet so far from what people knew, that most didn't believe it could ever come to pass. How could they suddenly abandon centuries of selfishness and distrust? How could they let go of the fight for survival and begin seeing each other as allies, not threats? Jack's words, seemingly naive, seemed more like a distant wish than a possible reality. There was skepticism in the air, a silent resistance. Many thought he was just delirious, that his final moments were filled with unrealistic ideas born from the proximity of death. After all, in that town, survival always came first. However, something began to change, even if imperceptibly. Jack's request was not something that simply faded away. No matter how much people tried to ignore it, something deep had been planted. In the following days, something curious started to happen. The people who had been around him began to reflect on what he had said. No, they weren't ready to radically change their lives right away, but just the fact that they had heard those words, simple yet profound, was enough to begin breaking down the barriers. At first, no one believed the town would change with just a simple request, but something was about to happen. The first signs of change came from where no one expected. The first signs of change came from where no one expected. It wasn't the most powerful or influential people in town who began to act. It was the simpler folk, those who normally lived on the fringes of the town's life, who began to put into practice what Jack had suggested. Slowly, they started helping each other in small, almost invisible ways. A farmer, who had always worked alone, began sharing his harvest with a neighbor. A blacksmith, once so closed off in his own world, began teaching his trade to a young orphan. These small gestures began to spread, but no one yet saw them as part of a silent revolution. There were no grand speeches, no big promises, just a shift in the small acts of daily life. The changes began to be noticed, but there was still a lot of resistance from the more skeptical townsfolk. They saw these actions as coincidence, something temporary that would soon pass. They couldn't believe that such a simple request could really transform the town. After all, if survival depended on fighting against one another, how could they now begin to live together as a true community? The mentality was deeply ingrained, and change seemed like an impossible task. However, as the days passed, what once seemed like a small spark began to spread. A small gesture here, another there, and suddenly the town began to transform. Not in a grand or immediate way, but in a more subtle and powerful manner. People began to realize that maybe Jack had been right. Maybe true strength wasn't in constant fighting, but in unity. Gradually, the resistance began to dissipate, and the mentality of distrust gave way to a mindset of collaboration. What had once been seen as an act of weakness began to be recognized as the true strength of a community. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because the transformation of the town wasn't something that happened instantly. It was a gradual process, where resistance began to give way, and the true power of unity was slowly revealed. What had seemed like an idealistic and impossible request began to become a reality. And little by little, the town started to realize that perhaps the key to true prosperity was there, in the simplicity of helping each other. All of this began to happen because someone, at the end of his journey, made a request that no one imagined would cause such a change. In the beginning, the change Jack Dawson desired seemed like an illusion. That town, marked by a constant struggle for survival, wasn't ready to let go of the barriers formed over the years. People were so used to living in an environment where distrust and fear of others dictated the rhythm of life that Jack's request seemed more like a utopia than a real possibility. However, even with the initial resistance, something began to happen in a silent and powerful way. It was a subtle change, but one that slowly began to take hold of the town. At first, no one made grand promises of transformation. There were no fiery speeches or grand actions. The change happened in an almost imperceptible way. A hand extended here, an act of compassion there. Slowly, people began to realize that maybe Jack was right. Maybe, instead of fighting each other, they needed to fight together, as a community, to overcome the difficulties. The first sign of change came with a simple gesture. A man who had always shut himself off in his own suffering approached a widowed woman and, without saying a word, offered her some food left over from his harvest. It was something small, but this act of generosity began to create a ripple that, slowly, began to spread throughout the town. The acts of mutual help began to multiply, but what was most interesting was the internal change that accompanied these gestures. People began to feel part of something bigger, as if the weight of loneliness was alleviated by the simple idea that they were no longer alone in the fight for survival. A farmer who had spent his whole life focusing only on his own fields started helping others improve their planting techniques. A blacksmith who had never cared about the troubles of others began teaching a young orphan how to forge tools so he could earn a living. These small acts of kindness and unity were, little by little, transforming not just the town, but the mentality of everyone who lived there. The change came slowly, but surely. Of course, not everyone was ready to embrace this change. Some still resisted, thinking that those acts of kindness were just a moment of weakness or naivety. But what they couldn't see was that these gestures, no matter how simple, were creating deep roots. Solidarity, which once seemed like a distant concept, was becoming a daily practice, and it was at this moment that the seeds Jack had planted began to bloom in a more visible way. What had once seemed like a foolish idea began to gain strength, and soon people started realizing that by coming together, they were stronger. When someone needed help building a house, others offered to help, without expecting anything in return. When a storm destroyed part of the fields, neighbors banded together to replant and restore what had been lost. And almost naturally, the town began to transform, not into a place of constant struggle, but into a true community, where mutual aid became the foundation for survival. The transformation that started with Jack's simple request was in fact a silent revolution. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but little by little, with each small gesture, the town began to reflect what Jack had always believed. The true strength of a community lies not in the fight for individual survival, but in unity and mutual support. The town was no longer just a place where people fought for survival. It was a place where everyone could lean on each other, learn from one another, and grow together. Now, I want to dive even deeper into this because the change that began with these small acts of kindness didn't stop there. It began to take on even greater proportions, and the impact of Jack Dawson started to be felt in ways no one imagined. What had seemed like a small and gradual transformation started to take over the entire town, and the acts of mutual help began to define not only daily life, but the essence of that community. What started as a simple idea, a request that seemed almost naive, soon became something much bigger than anyone could have predicted. At first, no one believed that the town, so marked by selfishness and the struggle for survival, could truly change. However, over time, Jack Dawson's request spread in ways no one expected. What seemed like just a dying man's last wish became the catalyst for a transformation that would endure for generations. With the first acts of kindness beginning to appear, something started to spread. Like an invisible virus of unity had taken hold of the town. In the beginning, people were still skeptical, acting more out of impulse than true conviction. But slowly, the resistance began to fade, and Jack's idea began to gain strength. His request for unity was not just accepted, it was absorbed and incorporated into the daily lives of everyone. Little by little, people began to realize that true prosperity wasn't about fighting each other, but about walking side by side, overcoming challenges as one. The impact of this request was so profound that over time the town transformed into a model of unity. Relationships between people began to change. The simple act of sharing became a natural reflection of a new, more compassionate mindset. There was no longer a clear division between the strong and the weak. Everyone was together, fighting for the common good. And the most surprising thing was that, even after Jack's death, this transformation didn't just continue, it spread to nearby towns and villages. The movement for unity he started was, in fact, the spark that ignited a collective desire for change that went beyond the borders of the town itself. Jack's simple request wasn't a fleeting change, it was a revolution that solidified over the years, creating deep roots in the culture of the town. The legacy of Jack Dawson transcended time. As time passed, the generation that had lived alongside Jack passed his lessons on to their children and grandchildren. The example of compassion and unity he had set was immortalized, not through monuments or glorious stories, but through the everyday actions of the people. They began teaching one another the importance of helping others, of putting themselves in someone else's shoes, and of understanding that the true strength of a community lies in its ability to support one another, especially in the hardest times. With this, the town not only became more united, but also stronger, because they knew they could rely on each other in any situation. The lasting impact of Jack Dawson's request was visible in the generations that followed. When the town faced new challenges, such as droughts, storms, and even epidemics, it was this unity that kept the town standing. The townspeople were more willing to share, collaborate, and help each other because they understood that this was the true path to survival and well-being. The request Jack made on his deathbed had been much more than a wish. It was the seed of a new mentality that would create a solid foundation for the future of the town. Now, let's go even deeper into this, because Jack's impact didn't just stay within the town where he lived. He began to influence people from all corners, and his life lessons based on unity and solidarity spread like a movement that transcended boundaries. What started as a simple and quiet request turned into a powerful transformation with effects that endured for decades. Jack Dawson's legacy wasn't just about kindness, but about a deeper vision of how the true strength of a people lies in their ability to come together in times of need. Jack Dawson's legacy wasn't merely about words spoken on his deathbed or fleeting acts of kindness. His impact ran much deeper. Over time, people began to understand that the true value of what Jack had left wasn't in the simple request for unity, but in the mentality he cultivated and the way he lived his life. The town was never the same again, and the people would never forget the sacrifice of that simple yet great man. He was able to touch the hearts of people who, before, hardly saw themselves as part of something larger. What's most surprising is that Jack's legacy wasn't something that was confined to the past, nor was it limited to what he did while he was alive. What he built was something that transcended his own journey. The town, once fragmented and disconnected, became an example of a united community where people helped each other, respected one another, and saw themselves as part of a whole. And the most beautiful part of all this was that, over time, the inhabitants themselves began passing this mentality down to future generations. Jack's request was just the beginning, but the real impact was the lasting change in how people related to one another. As the years went by, those who lived through the transformation began to remember Jack not only as a man who made a final request before he died, but as someone who knew how to live with a true mindset of unity and compassion. He didn't just preach the idea of helping one another, he lived it every day, with small actions, with choices that, at the time, seemed simple but had a massive impact. People began to understand that Jack didn't want them to just come together in times of need. He wanted unity to be a constant, to spread into every aspect of their lives, from work to daily interaction. Jack Dawson's legacy, the power of simple actions, and this legacy was passed down from generation to generation, not through grand ceremonies or speeches, but through the everyday actions of those who carried his message in their hearts. When the town faced hardships in the following years, such as droughts, storms, and other adversities, it was this legacy of unity and solidarity that brought people together to overcome challenges. What had once seemed like a final wish from a dying man transformed into a way of life, something that shaped the mindset of new generations. Jack Dawson's impact wasn't just felt in the immediate moment, it was felt throughout the entire trajectory of the town. But perhaps his greatest legacy was this: the understanding that often the simplest actions are the ones that shape the future of a place, a community, a people. The world was full of difficulties and challenges, but Jack showed that the true strength of any community does not lie in its ability to stand alone, but in its ability to support one another. This brings us to an important reflection. How can your own actions impact the world around you? In the midst of everyday challenges, have you been focused on creating connections, helping others, and thinking about the collective? Jack Dawson's example teaches us that true greatness is not found in grand deeds or recognition, but in the way we touch the lives of those around us, with simple gestures that are full of intention and love. Now, I want you to reflect on this. When in your life can you apply the same mindset of unity and mutual support that Jack taught his town? What simple gestures can you start practicing to create a lasting impact, just as he did? Sometimes, a simple request from a man can be the key to transforming everything around us. It seems small, doesn't it? A request made in haste at the end of a life when time is running out. But the impact it carries can echo for generations. Jack Dawson's request wasn't just words spoken at the end of his journey. It was a silent yet profound landmark that changed the destiny of everyone around him. And the most surprising part of it all is that, even without seeing the impact of his words, Jack left a lasting legacy. Jack Dawson may not have lived to see the transformation he caused, but his message remained alive in every act of kindness, in every act of unity that people began to do in the name of a greater good. What started as a request, something seemingly simple and even naive to many, became the foundation of a new mentality. He simply asked that people unite, share, and help one another. And that, my friends, was what truly made all the difference. It's easy to think that great transformations come from grand deeds, from the actions of great leaders or epic moments. But as we saw with Jack, true change often starts quietly, almost imperceptibly. With a simple request, a man on the brink of death changed the mindset of an entire town, and with it, changed the lives of everyone who lived within that new reality. He didn't need to be a traditional hero, didn't need a grand story to be remembered. His request was enough. The desire to create a true community where people looked at one another with more empathy and respect is what spread like a soft but immense fire. Reflecting on Jack Dawson's impact, today as we reflect on the impact of Jack Dawson, we can think about how our own actions and decisions can transform the world around us. Perhaps what Jack teaches us, more than anything else, is that it's not necessary to be famous or have great resources to change the reality of a town, a community, or even just one person. What truly matters is the intention, the will to act for something greater, to help others, without expecting anything in return. This brings us to the hidden truth that Jack reveals to us. The greatest strength we can have is not physical power, wealth, or control over others. True strength comes from the ability to unite, to help, to act with the heart. As we continue our own journeys, we need to ask ourselves, what can I do today, with the small actions I have at my disposal, to make my world a better place? Jack Dawson's story teaches us that the impact of a person isn't just in what they achieve, but in what they sow while they're here. Every act of kindness, every moment of compassion can be a seed planted in fertile soil, waiting to grow and spread. Jack's request wasn't just a message for that town, it was a message for all of us. He reminds us that even in a tough and often unforgiving world, we still have the power to change things, to transform others and ourselves through our daily choices. If you've made it this far, you know that Jack Dawson's journey is one of those stories that leaves a mark. And along this path, I believe something truly touched your heart, just like it touched mine. If this message was meant for you, if it resonated with you in any way, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." Let's continue this exchange of ideas and positive energy. If you feel like something here made you reflect, give the video a like too. It's a small gesture that helps spread these stories that can truly transform lives. And if you're connecting with this type of content, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here I always share stories and reflections that, like Jack's, have the power to change the way we see the world around us. Every time you subscribe, not only are you supporting the channel, but you're also ensuring that you'll catch more videos like this, and who knows, each one may bring a new insight to help you on your journey. Now, if you're looking for more stories that move you and make you reflect on your own life, there's another video right here that will touch your heart the same way. Click and join me over there. I'm sure you'll be moved once again. See you soon.